Have you ever wanted to give up? Like really, really give up? Maybe you've come to the point where you've morbidly counted some of the pills in your medicine cabinet. Or maybe it's at least crossed your mind how much easier it would be if you just put one in the chamber and pulled the trigger. Hopefully, if you've had a moment like this, you've at least been grounded enough to know that my life is not my own. And so you've gone to God and you've prayed a prayer for Him to take your life. I know some of us have certainly been here before, and as we see, unfortunately, Elijah, one of the greatest prophets of God, certainly had a time like this. Notice what he says in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. He says, "It is enough. Now, O Yahweh, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Now, when we look at the scriptures, we see Elijah is counted as one of the greatest prophets who ever lived. In many ways, he is a prophet like unto Moses, not necessarily in a messianic sense, but when you look at the details of his life, we find that he had a lot of the same experiences that Moses had, and many think of him as a counterpart to Moses. Moses is this prophet who brought the law of God to Israel, and Elijah is the one who is trying to bring it back. But he had a difficult ministry, to say the least. And what I want us to do is I want us to begin talking about what led up to this hour of darkness, this moment of despair. And then I want us to explore how God responded to it, for us to be encouraged as well as to understand how we can implement God's same strategy in our own encouragement to others. Now, before we get to 1 Kings chapter 19, if you will allow me to summarize the previous 3 chapters, just so we can appreciate what's going on and what led up to this moment. We find in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29, that after a civil war, Omri becomes king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Now, remember, what is God's purpose for a king? Ideally, the purpose of the king is to point people to God, to enforce the covenant that they made with God long ago at Sinai. That is God's ideal for a king. Now, when we consider the northern kingdom of Israel, they, for the most part, since the days of Samuel, acknowledged Yahweh as their God. Although when it comes to Jeroboam, they didn't always worship him the way that he wanted, but they at least acknowledged Yahweh as God, even though they messed some other things up. But by the time we get to Omri wants to get rid of Yahweh, or at the very least introduce a pantheon where Baal would sit at the top. Unfortunately, his son Ahab continues this practice, and his wife Jezebel seems to make things worse. Jezebel doesn't get a lot of good press in the scriptures. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of good press to give her. We find in 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 31, that it says this: "And if it had been a light thing for him," that is Ahab, "to walk in the sins of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, he took for his wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ithbaal, king of the Sidonians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him." So from the author of the book of Kings, his perspective is Ahab was already bad, but the worst thing he did was marry Jezebel, because she just made everything worse. And as we read 1st and 2nd Kings, we find that she is conniving, she is bloodthirsty, and she is one who seeks to kill the prophets of God. And apparently she exasperated the problem in Israel because she personally sponsored 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah. She likely assessed that the prophets of Yahweh were going to preach against her, or were preaching against her. So as we see in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 13, she sought to put them to death. And this forced many of them to go underground, likely years at a time. Now, when we consider 1 Kings chapter 18, by the time that, 1 Kings chapter 17, by the time Elijah comes onto the scene, things have gotten so bad that God essentially sends him to Ahab to say, "Hey, because you are not faithful to me anymore, because you are not loyal to me anymore, it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. As you can imagine, this does not make Elijah too hot with the royal family. So we see in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 10, they seek to put him to death, and they search for him in every nation under heaven. Thankfully, God hides Elijah away in Zarephath, of all places, Phoenicia. This is the place where Jezebel is from. Yet God sends him to live with a widow and her son, and he hides here for a few years, while around 100 other prophets are hiding away in caves. And eventually, Yahweh sends Elijah back to Israel, and he challenges Ahab to what in many ways is a theological contest. And you can see this more in 1 Kings chapter 18. Elijah invites the 450 prophets of Baal to meet him at Mount Carmel, and they're both going to make a sacrifice to their God. But the contest is whoever God lights their own sacrifice proves himself to be God and proves to be the God Israel should worship. Long story short, the prophets of Baal pray, and they cannot convince Baal to light the sacrifice. Elijah says a very, very quick prayer, and immediately God consumes his sacrifice in front of all the people of Israel, and they acknowledge that Yahweh is their God. And after this, the 450 prophets of Baal are put to death. Now, we can imagine after this that Elijah feels on top of the world. He feels victorious. He has hope for the future of Israel, and he can now come and be home, live with his friends and family, and live in a nation that honors God. And as he is making his way back to Jezreel, we find in 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 2, that Jezebel sends him a message. She says basically that, may the gods curse me unless I kill you within 24 hours. Now we know Jezebel means business, and Elijah recognizes that. So let's see what happens in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 through 4. 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 3 through 4. Then he was afraid, and he arose and ran for his life, and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. He himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Now, Elijah had given up so much to help restore Israel, and he had put his life on the line time and time again. And now Jezebel is seeking to kill him again. And he's probably feeling as though he's wasted his time. He's probably thinking to himself, well, I knew Ahab is just going to be a pushover. He's just going to listen to whatever his wife says. And I have not done any good at all. And some have said, well, Elijah should have just had more faith in God. And well, maybe that's true. But keep in mind, she has successfully killed other prophets, as Elijah will later acknowledge. He may be thinking to himself, well, my time has finally come. It's finally over. Better God kill me than Jezebel kill me. Now we see after he receives this message, he goes south. Really, really south. He goes into Judah, and you might think, well, maybe he could stop there. Maybe that would be safer. But then he goes all the way to the most southern part of Judah. He goes to Beersheba. And he doesn't stop there. He goes into the wilderness. Well, where exactly is Elijah going? As we see in 1 Kings chapter 19, 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 8, he's going to Sinai. Now think about how unusual that sounds. You may be thinking to yourself, well, Israel hasn't been at Sinai since the beginning, since God gave the law to Moses and Moses gave the law to Israel. And that's right. What on earth is Elijah doing walking all the way to Sinai? Well, we can only speculate, but some have suggested that he feels that things are so bad and so messed up that they have to start over, that he has to go all the way back to Sinai to renew the covenant and just start from square one. And when we consider what he says later, we can understand that he certainly feels things are that bad. But on the way there, he prays for his own death and he collapses under a broom tree. We can imagine this is probably the darkest hour in his life, but let's consider how God responds. Let's begin by reading verses 6 through 8. 1 Kings 19, verses 6 through 8. Actually, we'll begin at the ending of verse 5. Actually, we'll read verse 5 too. And he lay down and slept under a broom tree. And behold, an angel touched him and said to him, Arise and eat. And he looked, and behold, there was at his head a cake baked on hot stones, and a hot jar of water. And he ate and drank, and lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came again a second time, and touched him, and said, Arise and eat, for the journey is too great for you. And he arose, ate, and drank, and went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. So we see that as he is sleeping under this bush, the angel of the Lord comes to him. And of course, we know that this is a theophany. This is a manifestation of God. This isn't what we'd normally think of as an angel. And if it'd be easier, you can think of this as the pre-incarnate Christ. Likely this is the second member of the Godhead. And he comes to help Elijah. Now, have you ever been at a dark time in your life and you went to a friend to be cheered up and they just didn't do a good job about it? Maybe they said something like, you just need to snap out of it. Or maybe you should just try harder. Or maybe they've said, it can't be that bad. You could have it a lot worse. There are a lot of people in the world who have it a lot worse than you do. Or maybe they said something like this. It's all in your head. Or you're just overthinking things. I've known people who have been depressed and they go to a friend and they say, well, I'm depressed. And then their friend says, well, you have nothing to be depressed about. And they say, well, I'm still depressed. I just feel guilty for feeling depressed. So what does the angel of the Lord do for Elijah? Does he say, you're just freaking out about nothing. You're just overreacting. No, he simply wakes him up and says, I've made breakfast, or whatever time of day would have been fitting for that meal. Maybe it was lunch, maybe it was dinner, but he has cake for him, he has water, he has what he needs to feel better. And then he lets him go back to sleep. Some time goes by and he wakes him up again. And he says, hey, we need to do some more eating, we need to do some more drinking, because you got a big journey ahead. Because the angel of the Lord knows what Elijah's trying to do, and he knows he has to work through some things, and he can't do that if he's asleep. So we see that there's no lecture, no wisdom, no advice. He is just meeting the physical needs of Elijah right now. Now, let's go ahead and continue and see what God does next in verses 8 through 14. Actually, we'll do verses 9 through 14. Then he came to a cave and lodged in it. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I have been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forgotten your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left. And they seek my life to take it away. And he said, Go and stand on the mountain before the Lord. And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great strong wind tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, What are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. And I, even I only, am left, and they seek my life to take it away. We'll stop right there. Elijah then finally makes it to Sinai, and he puts himself up in a cave. The text says that he made it in the strength of the food that God had provided. I don't know what God put in the food, but apparently it was enough to get him all the way to Sinai. And when he gets there, does he get a long lecture or critique from God? No. God just simply asks him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Notice what he says. He says, "I have been very jealous for Yahweh, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I, even only I, am left, and they seek my life to take it away." Now notice one of the first things that he emphasizes. He says, "I am jealous for my God." The term jealous, the way we often use it today, is often only used in a negative context to describe envy or something like that. Often in the scriptures, it's used in a more positive way. It's used to describe the kind of passion and loyalty that a husband has for his wife, or a wife has for her husband, or what a husband desires from his wife, or what a wife desires from her husband. This is the attitude that God is often depicted as having, that he is jealous for his people, that he loves them, that he is passionate for them, and he wants that same kind of love. And we do find a few examples in the Bible of a few people being described with this kind of passion. We find Phinehas, we find Paul, and even Elijah describes having this same kind of passion. What he is saying is, I want what you want for Israel, and I want Israel to love you and to be loyal to you as they should be. But he says it's not working out because they've killed your prophets and they destroyed your altars. They cannot betray you any more than that. They cannot break your covenant any more than that. And likely from Elijah's perspective, that means it's over. There's nothing more to do. So we find that God reveals himself to him in many of the same ways we find that God revealed himself to Israel at Sinai, with wind, with earthquakes, with fire. And the one major difference is that when God addressed Israel at Sinai, it was in a thundering, booming voice, so much so that they said, "Moses, we don't want to hear God anymore. You can go talk to him. You deliver the message. It's too scary to talk to God." But ironically here, when God speaks to Elijah, it's in a low whisper, and he just asks him the same question. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, why is he asking the same question twice? Well, maybe he's trying to get Elijah to talk about it. We know when we have a problem, we have an issue, we have to verbalize a problem. We have to think out loud, and maybe that's what he's doing. But maybe part of the reason he's asking him to talk about his problems a little bit more is because God is about to address every one of his issues and concerns. Let's go ahead and see what God tells Elijah. Let's read verses 15 through 18. "And the Lord said to him, 'Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu the son of Nimshi. You shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abaloah, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death. And the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him.'" Now, to us, this may not seem like much of a pep talk. This may not seem like one of those beautiful quotes that you want to plaster on your wall or share on Facebook. In many ways, it just sounds like the future geopolitics of the Levant. It doesn't sound too encouraging, at least not to us. But believe it or not, this is everything that Elijah would need to hear, and it addresses every one of his concerns. Keep in mind, Elijah feels like it's over, like there's no hope. But God says, hey, don't worry about it. I got these guys, Jehu and Hazael, and they're going to clean house. They're going to get rid of a lot of the issues you see, and you're going to help bring that about. He also points out that there are 7,000 in Israel who are still faithful to him, who have never bowed the knee to Baal, and they're still faithful to me. God is essentially saying that, hey, it looks bad. It does look really bad, but you haven't been doing this for nothing. You have done a lot of good work thus far, and I have more work for you to do that will accomplish our mission to make
things better. Another thing that he addresses is that Elijah is not alone. He points out that there's this guy, Elisha, that he's going to anoint. And as we'll see, he'll be a friend, a partner, and eventually a successor to Elijah. And of course, the 7,000 we already mentioned who are loyal to God. And even though Elijah feels alone, he certainly is not. So let's consider a few points of this passage, and let's consider why Elijah fell so far, and let's consider what God did to encourage him. I think one of the first things we need to observe is that Elijah, at his darkest moment, focused on the worst elements of his ministry and his life. Now, keep in mind, Elijah did a lot of good in his ministry. He went to Phoenicia, and he fed a widow and her son for three and a half years during a terrible drought and famine. And not only that, he brought her son back to life, and he showed the light of God in a godless land. And when he came back to Israel, he got rid of more than 50% of their false prophets, and he got the people of Israel to acknowledge Yahweh as God once again. So he did a lot of good things, and he had a lot of things to be proud of, and he had a lot of things to be hopeful for in light of what God had already done through him. But his problem is a problem that we often have. When we hit a speed bump in our life or we hit a roadblock, we often focus on the negative. We often focus on the obstacles or the failures we have had thus far. And this is why Elijah spiraled so far, because he felt like it was over. He felt that there was nowhere else to go but Sinai. Now, I think we have to be self-aware that we have this same problem. And I know for me that often when things aren't going my way or when I'm having some challenges, it's very easy to have one negative thought after the other. And those negative thoughts in many ways just build on themselves and stay there longer than they should. And I have to remind myself that I have to consciously choose to think differently. I have to consciously choose to feel differently about the situation. And I think this is why Elijah struggled the way he did, because he focused on all the obstacles and the failures versus everything that God had accomplished thus far. Another problem that Elijah had was he was isolated from like-minded people. He was isolated from the people of God. Now, this wasn't his fault. When the royal family wants you dead, you can't have the same social life you had before for obvious reasons. So he had to leave his homeland, he had to leave his people, he had to leave his country. And even though Obadiah told him in 1 Kings chapter 18 that there were 100 other prophets like him, out of sight, out of mind. Yet he might conceptually know there are other prophets, that there are other people of God. But if he's not interacting with them, he feels alone. And even though he told God, I am alone and I'm the only one left, he certainly felt that way. Even though it wasn't true, he certainly felt it was true. And I think this is an important reminder to ourselves as people of God, that we have to surround ourselves with people who are jealous for God and his will and his church. Now, if we begin to feel isolated, normally it's our fault because we have so many opportunities to be surrounded by our brethren. It's not always, but sometimes it is our fault. And this should be a reminder to us because we do have some brethren who are shut in or cannot come to worship. And it's very easy for them to feel this kind of isolation. It should be a reminder to us that we should reach out to them and encourage them so they won't experience what Elijah felt. Now, I want us to consider several aspects about how God encouraged Elijah to encourage us, but also to give us guidance on how to encourage others. When Elijah was at his low point, begging for death, what did God do? Did he recite empty cliches and platitudes? Did he give him a pep talk about how he needed to pull himself up by his bootstraps? No. First thing he did is he made sure that he had food and he slept. Now, when often we know someone who is hurting, we want to say something nice, we want to say something encouraging, and that's nice, but it's often not what people need at the moment. We have to make sure that people who are really hurting, who are really grieving, are taking care of themselves. Keep in mind, our minds and our bodies have a symbiotic relationship. What affects our mind affects our body. What affects our body affects our mind. And if a person isn't taking care of themselves, if they haven't had a good meal, if they haven't rested, if they haven't slept, it's really hard to work out the issues that are going on in their mind and heart. So God, he skips the lecture, he skips the wisdom and advice, and he just first addresses the issues with his body so that he could process these more difficult problems. Now, I think there's another thing that we need to point out, is that God did not let Elijah sleep too long. Now, I know many of us may think you can't sleep too long. I'm sure many of us feel that way, especially Brandon. But when we're sleeping because we're grieving, because we're in pain, our sleep can begin to work against us. When we've suffered a great loss in our life, one of the only things we want to do is crawl in bed and not get up and just vegetate. I knew a lady a long time ago whose adult son had passed away in a car accident. And she said she just laid in bed continuously. And she said her other son came by. He's probably being very strategic about this. Keep in mind, this is in Alabama. And he said, hey, I just bought some property in Tennessee, and I just want you to come with me and go look at it. She probably didn't really need to see the property, but he knew it was just a simple excuse to get her out of bed. And she said, looking back, that if her son hadn't come by and encouraged her just to go and look at this property in Tennessee, that she probably would have never gotten out of bed. And we see that God would let Elijah sleep for a little bit, and then he would wake him up and say, hey, we got to eat, or he would wake him up and say, hey, we got to get going, we got to do these other things to work through these issues so you can get back to work and you can get back to your mission. And I think this is something we have to be aware of for ourselves and for our brethren, that if we're not careful, our homes and our bedrooms can become prisons that only enable our pain and prolong it. Finally, I want us to observe how God treated Elijah. Did he act as though he was disappointed or frustrated with him, or did he criticize him for being misguided? Well, no. As we see, God was very understanding and compassionate to Elijah and his struggle, because God knows Elijah is a man, and that he cannot see the big picture the way that God can see the big picture. He knows we often struggle to connect the dots the way that he connects the dots. And as David says in Psalm 103, verses 13 through 14, he says, as a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame, and he remembers that we are but dust. We can take comfort in knowing that when our God sees us maybe being unreasonable, maybe making a mountain out of a molehill, that he's patient with us and he helps us work through the things we struggle to understand. And I think we have to remember that when we are having these dark times in our life, we can't stay this way. We can't feel like it's over all the time. God has plenty of work for us to do, and he wants to use us to contribute to greater purposes and plans, and we can't do that if we feel like it's over all the time. And this is what God wanted Elijah to understand, that he had plenty more plans that he could participate in and make things better. It was just easier for God to see the big picture and harder for Elijah. Now, maybe someone is here today and you are experiencing a dark time in your life. Maybe it's like Elijah, hopefully no one's trying to kill you, but maybe nonetheless it feels that bad. Maybe you just feel that low, and if that's the case, we'd love to pray for you. We know God will give you the wisdom, the strength to do better, and allow us as your brethren to encourage you. And if you don't want to talk about it here, please reach out to someone here so that we can encourage you in any way that you need. But if you're here today and you're not a Christian, and you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, you're willing to repent of your sins and confess his lordship and put him on in baptism so you can receive the forgiveness of your sins, we can assist you with that right now. If there's anything we can do for you spiritually, please come forward as we stand and sing.